surveys show us, and your experience probably confirms, that in times of need, in times of grief and sadness, we tend to turn to another friend before we turn to the professionals.
When we as a collective group in the church care for people, that it matters somehow. It matters to Jesus, it matters to God, and that it's important that we care for one another together.
A Buddhist Nepali word and a concept that I think is very important for us as women, and for men too, and the word is Maitri. And Maitri is a kind of loving compassion for ourselves. And I think the notion of having loving kindness and compassion for ourselves is something that we as Christians need to embrace also, because it's hard to have that kind of attitude for others that we may be walking with if we don't feel that way about ourselves.
Another day, another jar, another judge. He startles me by speaking, "Will you give me a drink?" He can't be serious. "Why should I ask him, with a sudden burst of anger. "Why should I give you a drink? What has your kind ever given one like me but a double portion of scorn and disdain?" "Ah," he replies, "but if you really knew what kind I was, you'd be the one asking me for a drink. And I'd give it to you. I'd give you a drink of my own living water."
When I think about what a boundary is, I think about a fence. Something that tells us where something begins and where something ends. And so if we were going to define a boundary, we might say, this tells me what is me, what is not me. It tells me what is my problem and what is someone else's problem. And it tells me what I will do and what I won't do. And in the larger scheme, it tells us where I end and someone else begins.
Our culture is so focused on happiness that it almost feels un-American to grieve for very long. And other cultures have more cultural, societal rituals that help people grieve, that gives them permission to periodically remember and grieve those they've lost.
I'd like to tell you a story of a friend of mine who I think experienced what it means to share the reality of her life at a deeper level and to feel that healing and transformation. And it not only affected her, but it also affected her family. My friend had experienced some pretty serious childhood sexual abuse and was working in therapy on this. She was crying a lot, often when her children were around, and she would tell them, this is not about you. This is something that I'm dealing with. And one day her 10-year-old son came home from school and he had drawn this rather incredible art project. It had a little boat at the top with a man fishing. Underneath, where the hook went, the hook wasn't catching anything. There were all these lurking, large fish with open mouths, and some of them looked pretty sinister and frightening. And even though that little top where the boat was peaceful with the sun shining and everything looked nice and birds were flying in the air, underneath that water there was an incredible amount of things happening. Well, my friend looked at this picture and she thought, maybe I need to tell Scott just a little more of what's happening and what has impacted his mother, and that this matters. So she did. She sat down with him and she gave him a child's version of what she was dealing with in therapy, and she told him that she was going to be all right and that she was working with healing. And the little boy looked at her and said, "Well, Mom, I thought it was something like that." Every night this little boy had been having nightmares. But within 2 or 3 weeks of her telling him about this story, the nightmares disappeared. He stopped having the nightmares and was sleeping, likely finding out that what was lurking under the water, what was it in the family, the secret. When he knew that it was being worked at, that it was going to be all right, then he could sleep again.
Many times the stories that we carry are not something that we are aware of. But that doesn't mean they don't have a lot of power in our lives.